Welcome back to the Desert Hearth family. The wind that blew through Harding County carried two things: dust and despair. On the morning of October 3rd, 1887, it carried both in equal measure. The town square of Caldwell Flats was never a pretty place. Sun-bleached storefronts leaned against each other like tired old men. The water trough near the general store had cracked down the middle 2 summers ago, and nobody had bothered to fix it. But on this particular Tuesday morning, something uglier than the architecture had drawn a crowd. A wooden platform, hastily assembled, with 5 children standing on it, like livestock at market. 5 children, barefoot, unwashed, holding each other's hands like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Elias was 13, the oldest. His left eye was swollen nearly shut, the bruise purple and fresh, earned just an hour earlier when he'd thrown himself between a stranger's rough hands and his 7-year-old sister Marigold. His jaw was set. His eyes were cold in the way that only children who've been failed by every adult they've ever known learn to make them cold, not from cruelty, but from survival. Beside him stood Clara, 11, who had not spoken a single word since the night 6 months ago when she'd watched her mother take her last breath on a dirt floor, and her father follow 3 days later from a fever that no doctor came fast enough to treat. She communicated in glances, in the slight tilt of her head, in the way she would grip your sleeve if she needed something. She was brilliant, perceptive, and utterly unreachable. Next was Samuel, 9, a boy so flinching, so braced for impact at every loud sound that even a door slamming in the wind would send him to his knees. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to Samuel in the months between his parents' deaths and the county guardian taking custody. He never said. The trembling said enough. Then little Marigold, 7, with tangled copper hair and eyes too wide and too knowing for her age. She was the one who still asked questions, who had not yet learned that asking questions was dangerous. She was the one who would break a man. And finally, barely visible behind Elias's arm, was Thomas, 4 years old. He had not cried once since being taken. He simply watched everything with enormous dark eyes, clutching a piece of burlap that had once been a part of his mother's apron. Standing before them, clipboard in hand, was County Guardian Aldous Finch, a lean, gray-faced man in a wool coat that was slightly too large for him. Finch ran the county's orphan program the way a man runs any unpleasant duty, efficiently, without feeling, with one eye always on the ledger. "Able-bodied children," Finch announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the practiced tone of an auctioneer. "Available for placement. The county will match willing households. Priority given to those who can provide work, shelter, and basic Christian upbringing." Nobody in the crowd met the children's eyes. That was the remarkable thing. 30 adults standing in a semicircle, and not one of them looked directly at the 5 faces on that platform. They looked at feet. They looked at hands, checking for calluses, for signs of strength, for usefulness. A farmer near the back pointed at Elias and asked about his back. A woman in a blue bonnet inquired about Clara, not about who she was, but whether she could cook. A man in a black hat stepped forward and reached for Marigold's arm. She flinched but didn't cry out. Elias moved instantly, stepping in front of her, and the man shoved him back hard enough to split his lip against his own teeth. "Boy's got a temper," the man said flatly. "I'll take the quiet one instead." He nodded at Clara. That was the moment Caleb Hawkins stopped walking. Caleb had ridden into Caldwell Flats for flour and salt and nothing else. He was 41 years old, a solitary man by nature and by circumstance, owner of a modest cattle ranch 12 miles east of town called the Ember Creek property. He had no wife. He'd had one once, briefly, a kind woman named Ruth, who died of a fever the second winter of their marriage, taking with her the only version of Caleb that had known how to be soft. Since then, he had worked. That was all. He worked, he survived the winters, he kept his head down. He had a rule: don't get involved in other people's trouble. He'd built that rule carefully, brick by brick over 20 years. He watched the man in the black hat reach again for Clara's arm. He watched Elias, bleeding from the mouth, step forward again anyway. This boy with his broken eye and his iron jaw, stepping forward again for a sister who could not speak. And something in Caleb Hawkins' chest cracked open like old timber. He knew this. He had been this. Not the child on the platform, but the moment of stepping forward when every sensible thing said stay back. He had failed that moment once, a long time ago, with a younger brother he hadn't protected. He had spent 20 years carrying that. "Finch?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. He cleared his throat and said it again. "Finch. How much for all 5? The crowd turned, Finch turned, the 5 children on the platform turned, all of them except Thomas, who kept watching the piece of burlap in his hands. Finch blinked. "I'm sorry?" "All 5. Caleb walked forward slowly, hat in hand, sun in his eyes. "Together. How much to place all 5 together?" A murmur moved through the crowd. Someone actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Sir, these children aren't—" Finch began. "I know what they are," Caleb said. "They're brothers and sisters, and you're about to separate them. I'm asking how much to prevent that." Finch consulted his ledger with the manner of a man buying time while his brain caught up with the situation. The standard placement fee, he explained carefully, was $12 per child for administrative processing, provision costs, and county paperwork. 5 children would be $60. Caleb had $63.40 in the inner pocket of his jacket. 8 years of savings. Money he'd meant to use for new fencing and a second well. He pulled out the money without counting it and held it out. "Done," he said. The ride home was the quietest 12 miles Caleb Hawkins had ever traveled. He had the wagon. He'd come to town for supplies. At least he had the wagon. The 5 children in the back among the flour sacks, not touching each other, not speaking. Marigold had taken Thomas into her lap and was stroking his hair. Samuel sat with his knees pulled to his chest, watching the horizon with the expression of someone waiting for the next bad thing. Clara stared at her own hands. Elias sat at the back of the wagon with his legs hanging off the edge, watching Caleb's back with an expression that could have cured leather. 3 miles from town, Marigold's voice floated up from the wagon bed, small and absolutely sincere. "Mister, are you going to hit us?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. He let the horse keep walking. He breathed in through his nose and out slowly. "No," he said, "I'm not going to hit you." "Our last place hit us," Marigold said, as if providing useful logistical information. "That won't happen here." Silence. Then, "What about when we do something bad?" "Then we'll talk about it." Another silence. Longer. Then Marigold, apparently satisfied, went back to stroking Thomas's hair. From the back of the wagon, Elias said nothing, but he turned forward and watched the road ahead. The house at Ember Creek was not much. 1 story, 2 rooms, a sleeping loft that had been used for storage for the better part of a decade. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke. There were 4 chairs around the table and a 5th that had a broken leg propped against the wall. The front porch tilted slightly to the left. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told you something about how Caleb Hawkins had been spending his time. He showed them in. He gave them the loft, hauled up hay mattresses, extra blankets, a wash basin. He did not explain the sleeping arrangements as a favor. He explained them matter-of-factly, the way you explain where things are kept. That first night, he made cornbread and beans. He burned the cornbread slightly, more than slightly, and apologized for it without making a production of the apology. Clara, moving silently through the kitchen, had picked up the wooden spoon while he was distracted and stirred the beans without being asked. He noticed. He didn't comment. He just moved slightly to give her more room at the stove. They ate in silence. Samuel jumped when a log settled in the fireplace. Caleb waited until the sound had passed and then said, very evenly, "Just the fire," and went back to eating. Samuel slowly unclenched his hands. That night, after the children had gone up to the loft, Caleb sat at his table with a cup of cold coffee and looked at the ledger of what he had spent and what he had left. He had $3.40. He put his face in his hands, not from despair, not quite, but from the sheer weight of what he'd done. He sat like that for several minutes. Then he straightened up, picked up his pencil, and began planning the spring planting. The weeks that followed were hard in ways Caleb hadn't anticipated, and tender in ways he couldn't have predicted. Elias was the wall. Every kindness was pested, every quiet gesture examined for the angle behind it, every soft word weighted out to see what it would eventually cost. He worked like a man twice his size, from first light, hauling water and fixing fence line, and never asking for anything, because work, Caleb understood, was the armor Elias wore. If he was useful, he couldn't be discarded. One morning, Caleb found the boy in the barn at 4 a.m, unable to sleep, mending a harness in the dark with fingers that had been worked too hard for too long. Caleb sat down on a hay bale and didn't say a word. He just picked up the other end of the harness and helped. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. Then Elias, without looking up, said, "Why'd you do it? Buy us." Caleb thought about it honestly. "Because I knew what was going to happen if nobody did." Lots of people knew. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Lots of people knew." Another silence. "You're going to want something eventually," Elias said. "Everyone does." "I want the fence mended by Thursday," Caleb said. "That's currently the full extent of my desires." And for the first time, so briefly it was almost imagined, the corner of Elias's mouth moved. Clara was a different kind of quiet. Where Elias's silence was armor, Clara's was grief. A room she had locked herself into and couldn't find the door out of. She was the most efficient person Caleb had ever shared a kitchen with. She remembered where every tool was after being shown once. She could calculate the ratios for bread dough in her head. She left small, careful signals. A cup moved to where he'd reach for it, wood stacked before he thought to ask. He started leaving books on the kitchen table, whatever he had, a farmer's almanac, a Bible, 2 novels Ruth had owned, a surveying manual. He never mentioned them. He just left them and went about his work. One afternoon he came inside and Clara was sitting at the table with one of Ruth's novels open, reading with total absorption. She looked up when he came in, and for one unguarded moment there was a person looking back at him. Curious, present, herself. She quickly looked back down at the book. But that night, when Caleb said goodnight to the children from the bottom of the loft stairs, he heard, very quietly, barely a breath, a sound that was the beginning of a word. He didn't react. He just said, "Sleep well," and went to bed. Samuel's healing was the slowest and the most fragile and the most important. Caleb learned his patterns, learned which sounds made him flinch, learned that it was better to make noise coming into a room than to appear suddenly, learned that Samuel ate better when he could see the door. These were not things Caleb studied or made into a project. They were just things he noticed and quietly accommodated, the way you notice that the barn door sticks in the rain and you just lift it slightly when you open it. He never made Samuel feel observed. He just quietly, invisibly adjusted the world 6 inches at a time. The breakthrough came in the 6th week, on a cold November evening when a sudden crack of thunder shook the windows. Samuel was across the room and in the corner before the sound finished, knees up, hands over his ears, shaking so hard his teeth chattered. Caleb walked over and sat down on the floor, not beside him, just nearby, in the same corner. And he said, "I don't like it much either, to tell you the truth. Sounds like the whole sky is falling." Samuel looked at him through his fingers. "My mother used to say the angels were rearranging the furniture," Caleb said. "I thought that was a pretty stupid explanation when I was 9, but I've come back around to it." Slowly, in increments, Samuel's shaking lessened. He didn't move, he didn't speak, but he didn't move away either. Eventually, he leaned, just barely, against Caleb's arm. Caleb sat there until the storm passed. Marigold was the light. Not because she was untouched, she had been through everything her siblings had been through, but because she was the one who had decided, in some fierce and private 7-year-old way, that she was going to trust this man. She had asked her question on the wagon ride home and received an answer that satisfied her, and she had made her decision. She followed Caleb everywhere. She narrated everything she did. She had opinions about the chickens, about which direction the wind was blowing, about whether beans tasted better with or without the skin on. She informed him one morning, very seriously, that his biscuits were almost good. "Almost?" Caleb repeated. "They need more butter," she said, "and love. Mama always said cooking needs love in it or it tastes sad." Caleb looked at the biscuit in his hand. "I suppose I've been making sad biscuits," he said. "I'll teach you," Marigold offered generously. He let her teach him. He stood in his own kitchen and took instructions from a 7-year-old girl about the spiritual requirements of biscuit making, and he followed them with complete seriousness, and the biscuits, marginally, improved. Thomas spoke for the first time at week 7. He had been observing everything from a distance of approximately 18 inches, always close, never quite there, watching Caleb with those enormous dark eyes. He still carried the piece of burlap. He ate well, slept adequately, and allowed Marigold to fuss over him with complete equanimity. He spoke on a Sunday evening. Caleb had been playing an old, slow hymn on the battered parlor organ that had been Ruth's, the only piece of furniture he'd kept because he couldn't bring himself to sell it. And the children had drifted in one by one, as they often did on Sundays. Elias on the floor with his boots off, Clara on the chair with a book. Samuel, tucked small and quiet behind Caleb's shoulder where he'd discovered the sound was warmest. Marigold dancing very slightly with her eyes closed. Thomas, sitting on the rug, looked up at Caleb and said, "Again." Caleb stopped playing. The room went very still. Thomas looked at him steadily. "Again," he repeated. "Please." Caleb played the hymn again, and again, and a 4th time, until Thomas's eyelids grew heavy, and Marigold had stopped dancing, and Clara had set her book down just to listen, and even Elias was looking at the ceiling with an expression that might, in better light, have been peace. On the first Sunday of December, Caleb sat at his table after the children had gone up to the loft and opened the letter he'd received from the county 3 days ago and had been avoiding. It was from Finch. The letter informed him, in careful bureaucratic language, that there had been a complaint, from the man in the black hat, as it turned out, who had wanted Clara, suggesting that a single unmarried man of limited means was not a suitable placement for 5 children, and that a formal review would be conducted in January. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he folded it precisely and set it on the table. He wasn't a man who prayed exactly. He had what he considered a private working arrangement with God, the terms of which were vague. But he sat at that table for a long time with his hands folded and his head slightly bowed, and he said very quietly, "I need some help with this part." In the morning, he rode into town and found the only lawyer Caldwell Flats possessed, a retired cattle lawyer named Augustus Pell, who spent most of his days playing chess, and laid out the situation. It took 3 weeks, a visit from a county physician who examined the children and wrote a report noting that all 5 were well-fed, healthy, and showed significant signs of stability compared to their county intake records, a character statement signed by 14 of Caleb's neighbors, and 1 appearance before a county judge. The judge, a woman, which surprised Finch considerably, asked Caleb one question. Why these children? Caleb said, because they needed to stay together, and nobody else was going to make that happen. She looked at him for a long moment. Application approved, she said. Provisional for 6 months, reviewed annually thereafter. He told the children that night. He sat them down at the table, all 5 of them, Thomas in Marigold's lap, Elias at the far end with his arms folded, and he told them simply that they would be staying at Ember Creek, that it was official, that no one from the county was going to come and move them. Marigold burst into tears immediately, the loud, relieved kind. Thomas buried his face in her shoulder. Samuel exhaled a breath that sounded like it had been held for 6 months. Clara looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then she said, clearly, carefully, in a voice that was rough from disuse but utterly certain, "Thank you, Caleb." It was the first full sentence she had spoken in 7 months. Caleb pressed his mouth together and nodded and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he said, "All right, let's eat," and got up to get supper, and Marigold was still crying into his shoulder when he did it, and he let her. Elias was the last one at the table. He waited until the others had gotten up, and then he said, very quietly, to the tabletop, "I'll fix the north fence line tomorrow. I know it's been needing it." Caleb stopped in the kitchen doorway. "I know you will," he said. "I was counting on it." And Elias looked up, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was a small thing, barely a smile, the expression of someone remembering that they are allowed to trust. But it was real. The winter of 1887 was hard in the way all winters at Ember Creek were hard. Short on money, long on cold, surviving on thin stew and stubbornness, and increasingly on the particular warmth of 5 children who had decided, without making any announcement about it, that this was home. Caleb Hawkins was not a hero. He would have told you that plainly. He had made this decision the way a drowning man makes decisions, not from strategy, but from the inability to choose otherwise. He didn't know how to be a father. He learned it the way he'd learned everything else in his life, imperfectly, stubbornly, one day at a time. He burned things in the kitchen. He said the wrong thing on hard days. He worked too much and talked too little. He was learning, slowly, that love was not a feeling that arrived and stayed. It was a practice, a daily decision, a fire you kept feeding because the alternative was cold. But on Sunday evenings, with the organ playing and 5 children arranged around him in various states of drowsiness and peace, with Thomas asleep against his leg, and Marigold humming along, and Clara's voice finally, gently beginning to return, on those evenings, something in Caleb Hawkins that had been very quiet for a very long time began, carefully, to live again. He had spent 8 years of savings to keep a promise he'd made to no one, and every hard day of that winter he would have spent them again. Because sometimes family doesn't find you gently. Sometimes it arrives at the worst moment, costs everything you have, and asks nothing in return. And sometimes, if you're stubborn enough to stay, it becomes the only thing that was ever real. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, like, share, and let us know in the comments which moment stayed with you. We'll see you by the fire.